Okay, so this video is going to talk about Pareto efficiency and how we can illustrate this using an Edgeworth box. The last video showed you how to put the box together. So here we've got the box all constructed, and for Ann and Bill, and what I've done is I've drawn one indifference curve for Bill up here, and we're going to use this to get into Pareto efficiency. Now, the definition of Pareto efficiency says that an allocation is Pareto efficient or Pareto optimal if there is no way to make one person better off without making the other person worse off. So there's no way to feasibly make one person better off than without making the other person worse off in our two-person economy here. So let's see how this would work. I've drawn an indifference curve in here for Bill. And now it turns out that one way to think about this, a very convenient way to think about Pareto efficiency would be to say, how can we maximize Ann's utility subject to a constraint on Bill's utility? Now, why does that make sense? Because you might say, like, oh, aren't you really like advantaging Ann in this case? Because you're going to maximize her utility subject to a constraint on Bill's utility. Well, the reason why it helps, or the good way to think about doing this is say, you're trying to say, is there any way we can, Pareto efficiency occurs when there's no way we can make Ann any better off without making Bill worse off. So if we take this indifference curve for Bill, and now we say, like, okay, Bill, we cannot do anything that's going to put Bill on a lower indifference curve than this one here that we've drawn in. And now let's think about, of all these different points that are on Bill's indifference curve, which one would Ann prefer? Because that's that's going to be the one that's Pareto efficient. Because it's when we find the point on this indifference curve, on Bill's indifference curve, that Ann likes the best, then there's no way that we can make Ann better off without making Bill worse off. So I'll draw a normal kind of indifference curve for Ann, and this will be one that doesn't work. So here's an indifference curve. It's in green. Probably not a very good color to be using here. So I have an indifference curve here for Ann. And what we'll do is let's look at these points here where these indifference curves have come together, are intersecting. So here's one point. Here's another point. Let's call this point X. Well, we're using X rays. So let's call this a little a. Well, this little b here. And we'd ask, is point A going to make Ann as best off that we can, given that Bill has to remain on this indifference curve? And the answer would be no, because at this point here, if we move up into the left along Bill's indifference curve, from the shape of Ann's indifference curve like this, we can see that Ann would be moving up into the right, or in the northeast direction. And so as we move up here, we're going to get Ann to an indifference curve that's going to represent higher utility than what she has here at point A. At point B, there'd be the same thing going in the other direction. So if we start at B, we'd say B can't be Pareto efficient, because if we move down into the right along Bill's indifference curve, well, Ann's getting up above this indifference curve where she is starting from, and so Ann would prefer to move down into the right along Bill's indifference curve than to stay at point B. Since Ann would be made better off if we move down into the right from B, then B can't be Pareto efficient. Okay, so one way to figure out or finding Pareto efficiency is to find everything that's not Pareto efficient. Because when we've figured out what's not Pareto efficient, then what's left has to be Pareto efficient. So here I'll draw another indifference curve in here for Ann. And what we can see here is like, okay, well, if we started from A and moved to point C, well, here's how we know. Like, okay, yeah, C's Ann's on a higher level of higher utility and difference curve here at point C than she was at point A, so she's got to be better off. So that's how we know that A wasn't a Pareto optimal. And because there's a point like D on this indifference curve, we know that point B wasn't Pareto optimal. But B looks just like D, and C in a way looks just like A. That means that from point C, if Ann moves a little bit to the up and to the left along Bill's indifference curve, she would be getting to a higher level. She would be getting to a higher level of utility still. And starting from D, if we move down and to the right along Bill's indifference curve, Ann gets to a higher level of utility. So C and D aren't going to work either. So what will work? Well, we'll draw an indifference curve in here. And we'll be at a point like E, where Ann's indifference curve just happens to be tangent to Bill's indifference curve. E looks different than either B or D or C or A. There's no way to move up and to the left from E, stay on Bill's indifference curve, and not make Ann worse off. Because if you start at E, this level of utility for Ann, once you move to the left here, you can see she drops down to a lower level in difference curve, a lower utility in difference curve. If she moves to the right, she's going to drop to a lower utility in difference curve. If she moves away from point E at all, she gets lower utility. And we know if we're staying on Bill's indifference curve, we're not making Bill worse off. So of all these points on Bill's indifference curve, the one that makes Ann best off is at point E, where these indifference curves are tangent. That means that point E has to be Pareto efficient, because again, if we're at point E, there's no way we can make Ann better off without making Bill worse off. And we do need that second part of that, because we could, for instance, try to move Ann up to an even higher level of utility here. Here's an even higher level of utility indifference curve for Ann. So we think of like a point F here. F on Ann's indifference curve here is a way to make Ann better off than we would be at E. But the second part of that definition isn't going to hold. If we move from E to F, Ann is better off, but Bill is worse off. Right? If we drew in Bill starts from this indifference curve, and when Bill moves towards his origin, he's going to be on a lower level, a lower utility indifference curve. So moving from E to F is going to make Bill worse off. That's not allowed under Pareto optimality. Now, if we think about Pareto optimality or Pareto efficiency, what would turn out to be the case is that there's lots of different Pareto efficient points in the Edgeworth box. Actually, I've already drawn two in here, because here we have E and here we have F, and they're both points where the indifference curves are tangent. Every point in here in the box where the two Pearson's indifference curves are tangent is a Pareto optimal point. So if we came down here to this level of utility for Ann, and then drew in a indifference curve for Bill, that's going to just be tangent. We'd have another Pareto efficient point here. So G, which is the tangency point of these two indifference curves, would also have to be Pareto efficient. So there's a whole bunch of Pareto optimal points in the Edgeworth box. If we connect all of these, actually there's an infinite number. If we connect all of these Pareto optimal points, we get a curve that goes through here. Oops, it's supposed to be hitting that origin up there. Now it would look like this, and this would be the curve showing all of the different Pareto optimal points in the box. And this gets a special term, that the contract curve, or the set of Pareto optimal points. Now, one thing we can see about Pareto optimality is that both corners of the box. This corner down here where Ann has nothing, and this corner up here where Bill has nothing, they're both Pareto optimal or Pareto efficient. Because if Bill has everything, the only way to make Ann better off is to, if Bill has everything in our economy, the only way to make Ann better off is to take something from Bill. And Pareto optimality wouldn't allow that. So Pareto optimality or Pareto efficiency doesn't say anything about distribution. The only thing that Pareto efficiency is concerned about is getting maximizing the gains from trade. One way to think about any point that's not Pareto optimal, any point that's not Pareto efficient, that's not on the contract curve, there is a way you can adjust to make both parties or both people in this economy better off. And it's got to be the case that if you can make both people better off by their own judgment as reflected in their own utility functions, then if everybody's been made better off, then we have to have a better situation in society. But Pareto optimality doesn't judge the distribution of utility between the two people, or the fact that, like, oh, the point down here where Ann has nothing and Bill has everything is Pareto efficient. And so some people would look at that and say, well, that's a weakness of Pareto efficiency as a normative criteria, because it would allow for Bill to have everything and Ann to have nothing. We would say that's Pareto optimal, because the only way to make Ann better off would be to take something from Bill. Pareto efficiency is really about making sure that we've maximized the gains from trade, that there are no gains from trade left to be exploited in the economy. There's no way we can make somebody better off without making another person worse off, or making somebody else worse off. And so that's what Pareto efficiency is all about. And if you do have an initial endowment, as they talk about in the book, if you do have an initial endowment, and if you think that that initial endowment is somehow just, if you have like property rights in the economy, if you think that the initial distribution of property is just, then Pareto efficiency, I think, takes on strong normative appeal, because if you're starting from a point, like say A, where he's like, point A is just, and it says a just distribution of property in this economy, Pareto optimality would be to say, okay, we want to get to some point here on the contract curve that would be in the region of gains from trade relative to our initial endowment. And that's what economics is really all about. When we talk about efficiency, it always comes back to this idea of Pareto efficiency. There's some way to make both people better off without making somebody else worse off. Some way that which we could reallocate goods, in this case, this is a pure exchange kind, or resources in such a way as to make at least one person better off without making anybody else worse off. And from a normative standpoint, I mean, that's a pretty intuitive, and that's a pretty desirable way to judge two different things. So if you're starting from one point and you can make one person better off and not have to make anybody else worse off, then that's a Pareto. We actually call that a Pareto improvement. And that would be the kind of improvement, if you're only ever making Pareto improvements, you can't really be harming society very much. If you start from one point and you only make Pareto improvements, you're not going to make anybody worse off, because Pareto optimality doesn't allow that to happen. But you may possibly make, you're going to make some people better off. In fact, you may possibly make everybody better off. So Pareto efficiency is really what is ultimately behind everything in economics when we talk about efficiency. And it really is about the gains from trade, and trying to make sure that we capture all the gains from trade. And that's why this Edgeworth Box, although it's a very simple economy, it is part of the reason why it's so powerful, so valuable, because it allows us to really get a good sense of, to be able to see the gains from trade in an economy. And that's what economic activity is all about, trying to capture those gains from trade.